my name is Jehan. I'm a musician. I've got a whole bunch of looping videos on my channel. Feel free to check them out, but let me get to the point of this video. What kind of looper should you use? Now, it's a really big question. It's a big question because you can spend a lot of money on loopers and musical equipment in general, and most musicians are pretty broke, so wasting money is not a good thing. So over the years, I have tried a whole bunch of these pedals, a whole bunch of different looping rigs, and there's been pros and cons for each one. And I'd like to walk you through some of the stuff I've learned so you can maybe figure out right now with where you're at, what's the next thing you should buy or invest in and start building and then learning how to use. There are two broad approaches that are pretty separate from each other. You've got hardware and you've got software. You can use hardware like this. This is the RC300 from Roland. It's a Boss pedal. You can use this and do some pretty cool things. It's great for live gigs. All you have to do is plug your guitar, plug your keyboard in, and you're good to go. You can plug a mic in as well, so you can do vocal looping. It's pretty awesome. On the other hand, if you use Ableton, you're essentially looping with your computer, which means that if you play live, you'd have to bring your computer along, which can be a pain, but it does allow you to do some pretty cool things. With Ableton, they do have a whole bunch of MIDI controllers that essentially act like hardware, but you're still fundamentally using your computer. Here is the Ableton Push 2. It's pretty awesome. I use this in concert with an APC40, which allows me to do some pretty out there stuff. So it's really, really awesome. But with that flexibility comes a whole lot of other problems, which are worthwhile, but things you should be aware of. So the simplest setup for a hardware looper is your instrument, a cable, a basic looper, like a single track looper, like the RC1, the Boss RC1 from Roland, which you can get for 160 bucks in Australia. Then another cable, and that goes into your amp or your PA, or it goes into your interface if you're recording it. That allows you to do stuff like playing a gig and then tapping your guitar and getting a bit of a beat going. It allows you to maybe lay down some chords so you can do a guitar solo at some point. If it's really, really simple looping you want to do, that's all you need, and that's 200 bucks. So at that point, if that's all you want to do, don't go further than that. The other options are more expensive, so there's no need. If what you want to do is get more out there with your looping and do stuff like looping with vocal looping as well as guitar looping, or looping both at the same time, you're pretty well set with this one. You can also do other things like having different parts that you can turn on and off. You've got like 3 tracks here, so you can create a really complex part. You can overdub as much as you want, so there might be 5 parts on each, and then you can turn them on and off. So you can create one for percussion, one for bass, and one for kind of some chords, and then you can solo on top, and it sounds like a full one-man band. You can also have different parts, like you have like a verse, bridge, chorus, so you can make it that you have a whole song, and you can save things and use them for pre-recordings if you want to not have to make your audience watch you build up every single loop, every single song. So this is pretty powerful. It also has some inbuilt effects that you can apply to your instrument. You can also apply it to your loop, so you can do some remixing on the fly. So this is pretty damn cool. But what does it look like? So at this point now, instead of just having your instrument, you now have your instrument, a cable, and this, which sells for about 780 bucks in Australia right now, at least when I looked online. You got a second mic, most likely, and an XLR cable for that. Let's not include that in the price. I don't know what kind of mic you want to buy, so add that to your own costs. And then after that, that other cable that then connects to your PA, your amp, or maybe connects to your interface if you're doing it for recording. So assuming you have all the additional gear, the incremental cost here is 600 bucks. It's 800 bucks to have this with the cables and everything else. The other option was 200 bucks. Is it 4 times better? I'd say yes, because turning on and off loops is pretty cool. Having those inbuilt effects is pretty amazing as well. I've got a video that I'll link here that shows what I've done in the past with this. It's pretty exciting. So if you're serious about looping, I'd recommend this very highly. That said, if you have multiple instruments and lots of effects, so if you have like a bass guitar or an electric guitar with like a really, really complex like rig of effects, and then you have maybe some like electronic drums, which I've actually done before, things start to look a little bit crazy. So here's one of my videos, and this is where I've kind of gone way too far with all this stuff. So I've got electric guitars with a Strymon Timeline and a Strymon Big Sky. So these are both already expensive pedals, my gosh. I've got a Boss GT100, also expensive. Oof, what was I thinking? And then it all goes into a mixer, which allows me to have to mix all the instruments coming in and not having to have a switch. Goes into a mixer, and I've also got a bass going to the mixer. I've got the electronic drum kit going into the mixer as well. It's an Alesis drum kit. You throw it all together, and then that mixer then goes into your looper, and that allows you to loop anything that's going through that mixer. It's good, but my word, was there so many things that could go wrong. The amount of cables you've got here is a lot. Getting the metronome is hard because you've got those two outputs I showed you before. You need those outputs to give yourself a metronome. Like without a metronome, if you're doing this kind of looping, there's so much going on. If you're a little bit out of time, everything sounds awful. So if you're just doing a little guitar tapping, that's not a big deal. If you've got 5 parts and they all need to be pretty damn perfect, it's hard. So what does it sound like? Well, you can be the judge. Have a listen. So what's the total cost here? If you forget about the additional instruments and all the additional pedals and stuff I've got, because that will depend on what you want to get for yourself. So you have to look into the cost of those individual things. We're looking at like maybe $500 for a mixing desk. You could go for a really simple, cheap one for like 200 or maybe 100, I don't know. But you want to be able to mix things, because if you've got a bass going in, you want that to have a different EQ to a guitar. Otherwise you have this bass that just has no oomph, or you have a really muddy sounding guitar. So I'd recommend going in and getting something that allows you at least do that. But looking at that rig I had there, we're talking about like $4,000. That's a lot of money. And I saved up for many years to get all that stuff. And it was fun, it was good, but it probably wasn't the best way for me to do that. Learn from my mistakes. Now, I think it sounds pretty decent, and to be honest, I've seen people do some amazing stuff with a very similar setup to this. I saw this duo rocking in this bar once, and they made it sound insanely good. There was just 2 of them, but it sounded like a whole band. Everyone was bouncing off the walls. They were having so much fun. And looking at their actual setup, they had cables everywhere on the ground. Like they had a complete nightmare of a setup, but they got a lot of juice out of it. I talked to the guy afterwards. He said that they had learned by making a lot of mistakes. So he didn't necessarily say this is the best way to do it. It was basically pure talent and pure luck at work there. So I'd say you can do a lot with this. This might be a good setup for you, but just be wary of the fact that all it takes is one cable just to break, and then you have to go through and figure out what the hell's broken. You don't want to have that many cables with that, so many things that can go wrong. But it's also worth mentioning that there are some pretty out there people, some big names like Mark Rebelais. He uses a Roland looper. He uses an RC505, I think. So this setup isn't that different from what he has. I don't know exactly what he's got set up, but it's fundamentally using a similar concept. He just does it very, very well. What about software looping? This is where things become totally different, because your whole old looping stack becomes redundant. It just is like, most of it becomes clutter. Like, sure, you've got your pedals, you've got other stuff, but you don't need the mixer, you don't need the Roland looper at all. So that's like, over $1,000 of equipment that you can just kind of throw out or sell if you're smart. For the simplest setup, you need a reliable computer. Let's just call that $2,000, because you don't want to have a crappy computer that just doesn't really work, because if it stops working in the middle of a performance, especially if you're performing live, you're having a terrible time. So I'm just going to put that out there. Get a decent computer. Next, you need an audio interface with enough inputs. If you're recording multiple instruments, which is what this is great for, if you only have 2 inputs and you got 5 instruments and you got you're connecting and reconnecting instruments, you're not going to be able to put on a decent live show. I spent a good bit of money getting a PreSonus Studio 1810C. They're pretty decent. They're like $600, but it's got like heaps of inputs. So I can connect all the different instruments I've got here, and it's amazing. But you could go cheap, especially if you're starting out. If you get something secondhand that's just got 2 inputs, there's a whole bunch of Tascam audio interfaces, and they do the job fine. So don't spend more than you need to. After that, you need a DAW, digital audio workstation. I recommend Ableton because it's kind of built for this. The full version costs about $600, but you can start with the free version. It would allow you to get a lot out of it. So, cut costs where you can. Absolutely. Then there's like a MIDI controller, which is optional, but I recommend the Push 2. What's good about this is if you connect a pedal to it, you can set something up for looping and use the pedal to start and stop looping, which is really awesome. Another thing you got here is you can use it as a MIDI instrument to play drum parts, which is cool because then you don't have to sit with this ridiculous electronic drum kit that you don't have space for in your room. It makes you almost undateable. Yes, that's pretty much the effect it had on me. Another thing you can do is with looping, the Push 2 is designed for looping, so it has things like setting a fixed length to looping, which I don't know that Ableton does very easily, or at least it doesn't think about it. It doesn't have it front and center as a feature, and it's pretty nice for turning things on and off and stuff like that, although that's when I use the APC40, because APC40 is even more intuitive. So this comes up at like $1,100, so it's not cheap, but it does give you a lot of bang for your buck. You could pretty much take a mic, this computer interface, boom, you can put on a show with that. You just need to plug them together. So you got your amps, your PA, you're pretty much fine. You connect the output channels of your audio interface to the speakers, and boom, you're good to go. So the price tag here is pretty much $2,000 if you haven't got a decent computer. But if you've got a good computer already, you got a head start. And then after that, it's just about making sure you have an audio interface and maybe get a trial version or a free version of Ableton. So that can be pretty low cost for people who've got a lot of this stuff already. Another thing is the benefits are huge. You loop 2 separate channels, so that means that you can mix things. You don't just get this one output with everything going into a looper and then everything coming out as one stereo signal. You can record guitars and pan the guitars to the left, bass put in the center, record drum parts and have each individual drum mixed. You can set it up so that when you play, you have a mix that sounds good. You can also afterwards do some post-production where you mix it so it sounds super swish and super nice. And if there's a bit where you messed up, you can just remove it or something like that. That's super cool. So if you're doing studio recording to make videos for YouTube with looping, this is a dream. And if you're putting on a massive concert and you need to make sure that you can have a nice sound experience for your audience that scales to speakers that are huge where everything can be heard, yes, this is amazing. But if you're putting on just like, let's say you're playing at like an open mic night, the setup time for this stuff isn't worth it. You're better off using like one of the more basic setups. So that's where there's a bit of a to and fro. So let's look at a video of mine. I'll walk you through what I'm doing here. I play each part and they're all mixed the way I want. I've set it up beforehand so that I have the panning and the EQ and the reverbs and stuff all set up. I can add beats with the Push 2, and I can also add effects as I go, kind of remixing it, making myself like a DJ as well as a looper. So this is pretty exciting. And also keep in mind that Ableton allows you to do stuff like automating your looping. That's what Elise Trudeau does. It's what Blink Beats does as well. They have it all set up so that a channel will just kind of turn on and be expecting audio, and they'll play, and then it'll just record. It'll just take that, and then it'll just play it whenever it's triggered. So it's all basically, it's like having a fully mixed song, and it's just waiting for something to start at a certain point and stop at a certain point. Now I've done a video like that. You can see it here. It's fun, but it doesn't really give you any room for error. If you make one mistake, it'll be repeated for whenever that part is triggered. And if it's like the bass part, or if it's on some part in the middle of the song, you basically have to start again if you make a mistake, which live is a nightmare, I'd imagine. That's what Blink Beats does. I don't know how he lives. Here's one of my looping videos and you can get a sense of how it sounds. So I think it's pretty fun. I had a lot of fun with this. I think the sound of it is pretty cool, but it's not a silver bullet. I'd say there are 3 challenges to using this type of looping. So the first challenge is price. This is the more expensive route if you just want to do simple looping. But if you want to do multi-instrument looping, this is pretty much where it's at. And if you want to do stuff where you're having beats and it's like a big dance party with like almost like a DJ style thing with instruments on top, this is what you want as well. This is more high production, but it's complex. Like, you're learning how to be a producer. That's the second problem. If you're really a musician and you don't know much about audio engineering and you haven't done much looping, getting to this is just going to overwhelm you and you'll probably struggle, and I don't think you'll get much out of it for a while. So if you're pretty good as an audio engineer, or if you're super serious about putting on intense, involved looping, do it. But if you're not ready for that kind of thing, don't. The last issue is you're bringing a computer and an audio interface to your gigs. One, that's kind of risky because people could steal it or damage it, more likely. The other problem is you are relying on this computer, which could just die at any point. If you have a computer that's not super reliable, this is a very dangerous way to go. So still recommend it, but maybe have your iPod or whatever it is you use to play music available so that you can just connect and have something to play to people who are pissed if in the middle of your set everything dies. Let's wrap up. I got my first looper and I thought it was faulty because I couldn't play in time and all my loops sounded crap. And I thought that was the looper, not me, but it was me. So the first thing to do is just learn how to loop. So if you've never done any looping, get a really simple looper and learn how to loop. If you've got a really nice computer and you've got Ableton and you're pretty good at production, maybe start with a software looper instead. But for most people who just don't know that stuff really well, you might find yourself getting lost in the technical side of things when what you need to learn how to do is just be a good enough musician to do looping. From there, as you get more experience and you figure out what it is you want to do, think about, is it lots and lots of instruments with a really complex sound that requires a bit of mixing and production at the end of it? If so, you're looking more at Ableton and software looping. If it's something quite simple, or you just really hate the idea of learning production, stick to your hardware loopers, especially if you're primarily about being live and playing in kind of smaller venues. If you're London Grammar, like I said before, go for Ableton. That's what they use. It's awesome, but to get a super reliable setup for live performance here could cost a pretty penny. So I'd recommend hardware in the first instance if you're doing live looping in gigs and stuff out there in the world. Either way, looping is awesome. So the TLDR of this is get one of these setups and get into it because it's amazing. The stuff you can do with this stuff is mind-boggling. So I really look forward to seeing your comments. I'd like to know what kind of looping setup you have. And if you have any questions for me or things that I can help you with, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks so much. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.